Okay, going on to our next caller. Caller, thank you for being patient with us. What is your name and where are you calling from?
My name is David, and I'm calling from Jerusalem.
Okay, perfect. Okay, go ahead with your question. Thanks for calling. Welcome to Texas.
No problem. Holy Rebbe, this is Dave in Jerusalem. I wanted to ask, what did all of these disciples of Jesus get out of creating all of these stories and changing our, beautiful Torah? What did they get out of it?
Your question contains a presupposition that that Jesus' followers got anything out of anything. That means we, in fact, do not have any writings of Jesus' disciples with us. So we don't have an idea. All we can do is we can look around us and see the Benny Hinn's today, and we can see religious leaders all over the world, and why do people start religions and so on, a variety of reasons. But one thing I try not to do is engage in speculation. As it turns out, although you have books in the Christian Bible that are named after disciples, in particular, I'm thinking about Matthew and John. In fact, these books do not identify themselves as being written by Matthew and John. They're written anonymously, so we don't have the writings of any disciples. It is very likely that people who lived in the Galilee in the first half of the first century were completely illiterate, which means that they could not write. There is no way any fisherman in the Galilee could have written the Gospels, which were no doubt written by highly literate Greek-speaking Christians in the second half of the first century. In fact, in the book of Acts, we are told that the disciples were illiterate. You'll find in Acts chapter 4, verse 13. These guys were, the literacy rate is, historians and people who specialize in this, about 3%. And if you think about this just for a moment, you go, 3% is really small. We're not talking, let's think about the people who are listening to this show, you're completely literate in English, means you can speak the language and you can read the newspaper, but how many people could really write a 16 or 28 chapter book? Very few people could. So these are very well written books. These books are written, if you had to write a book, a rhetorical work of many chapters, and Mark is well written, Luke is very well written. These were not written by disciples. So therefore, when you ask me, what would the disciples have at stake, or why would they do this? We have no clue what they did, were their disciples, who they were. We don't have any literature written by them. And as I said, the Gospels do not claim to be disciples. When Matthew speaks about Matthew, the tax collector, he speaks about Matthew in the third person, not about himself in the first person, right? He doesn't say, I, Matthew, was walking down the street. He doesn't say, I met Jesus. None of them say that. This is the idea that Matthew and John would be one of Jesus' disciples, we are told, John the son of Zebedee, as opposed to quite a number of other Johns in the Christian Bible. It is the Catholic Church in the second century that will ascribe these books to disciples, particularly Matthew and John. These books, because the manuscripts, I know this might surprise folks, but although a Christian Bible will say St. Matthew, or the book of Matthew, that does not exist in the Greek manuscripts. There's no, this is Matthew. These are ascriptions put there toward the end of the second century. People like Irenaeus, who was the French bishop of Lyon, he certainly would be very prominent, and he would It's that period of time that the church is saying, okay, these books are lightly written by these people. There are a lot of forgeries going around, but these books don't claim to be written by disciples. The book of Mark is, according to Catholic tradition, was written by an assistant of Peter, and the book of Luke was written by a companion of Paul, according to this Catholic tradition. Well, that's all nonsense, and this is all late, and because the church will have to to give these books what's called apostolic authority, which means that someone who was an apostle of Jesus or a companion of an apostle had the authority to write this. But so I'm coming back to your original question. If anyone tells you they know what the disciples thought or who they were, or what their names were, or anything, or what motivated them, they don't know what they're talking about, because we have no non-Christian literature that's contemporaneous of this period. Nothing. Zero. Now that I've made that huge speech, okay, we could look at history and try to come up with a story that would comport with that period. So that we can do, okay? And if I can guess at things that could have easily occurred if I assemble together, if I assemble together what would be consistent with that time period. So the consensus, again, the consensus speculation among Christian scholars is, and this would make a lot of sense given what we do know of the time, is in the first 30 years of the first century, this was a really bad time to live in the land of Israel. It was horrible. Okay, the Jews had lost all autonomy. We were living under Herod and it was just a disaster. We have Pontius Pilate, all these, and Caesar Augustus, the Emperor of Rome. This was a very bad time. And if you were living in the land of Israel under the Roman occupation in the first century, you basically, all you dreamt about is that this hell would come to an end. That's all, okay? You were living in hell. You were living in a very, very difficult time. And all you wanted, all you craved, all you hoped is that God's kingdom, that God would destroy the Roman Empire, Edom, and would usher in the Messianic age. That's all you wanted. All you wanted was God's kingdom to come to earth. This is called an apocalyptic eschatology. You wanted that. That's the term. Although the word apocalypse really means revelation, but an apocalyptic eschatology means a spontaneous combustion of what was happening as a result of the hand of God. Because at the time, it's not like the Israeli army today, which is the toughest army in the Middle East by God's will. But at the time, the Jews were very weak and the Romans were very strong. It was inconceivable that the Jews could overthrow Rome. So if you were running around saying anything, if you had any message, your message had to be that God's kingdom was coming and Rome is going to be destroyed. The Roman Empire is going to be destroyed. If you did not include that in your message, you might as well stay home. People weren't interested. It means you had nothing to say, because that's all people wanted to know about. People wanted to know when this hell would come to an end, and the only way it was going to happen is through God's intervention, a spontaneous, completely miraculous intervention, which is obviously miraculous because there was no Israeli army like today, but we really do have free will, where we can say, well, maybe the Israeli pilots are really smart and the best army in the world. That's why they wipe out the stupid Arabs. People say that without taking into account that it's God's spirit, not our might and power. But at the time, that was inconceivable. Now, if you were caught by the Roman Empire saying that God's kingdom, it was coming and the Roman Empire was going to be destroyed, there was only one thing that would happen to you, and that is you would be executed via crucifixion. There were many ways that the Romans had to kill you. And really cheap, inexpensive ways to kill someone. Just take a second, a sword, and chop the head off, and that would be the end of it. It wasn't difficult to kill somebody, but crucifixion was a very expensive way to kill someone, but the Romans did it because they wanted to make an example out of folks who were plotting, planning an insurrection, or were preaching this, because the Roman Empire was like North Korea. They were like Kim Jong-il, or whatever that dog eater's name is. It was like they didn't want problems. So again, I'm not saying this is what happened, but if I had to guess what is very likely to have occurred, we have Josephus, we have Philo, we have Pliny the Elder. We've got a lot of historians supplying us with information about thousands, not just tens of thousands, but estimated to be hundreds of thousands of executions, many of them via crucifixion, to the point Josephus tells us that the Romans literally ran out of lumber. And the reason why they would run out of lumber is that when someone was executed, so they were put on a cross, and they were there for 4 or 5 days, a week. It depends if they were like healthy and so on. Naked, they were defecating on themselves, humiliated. And Jerusalem has very moderate temperature. It's just really always nice. So people it's not like someone was broiling out in the Sinai desert. A person could survive on a cross for a week. Josephus describes walking outside of the walls of Jerusalem, where it was a normal sight to see crosses all over with Jews crucified, just waiting to die, and then their bodies left to be eaten by scavengers, by animals. That was another part of the crucifixion. You were not going to have a burial.
And just a footnote, how long was Jesus on the cross? 6 hours?
It depends. So if you read Mark, he was up there from 9 in the morning. If you read John, he was up. John wants Jesus to be crucified at the time when the Passover lambs are crucified. So John is going to alter is going to have the time of Jesus' crucifixion at the 6th hour, which means afternoon, which would be consistent with when the Passover lamb was sacrificed, because that's John's theology. So therefore, datum is adjusted in order to comport with John's theology that Jesus was the Lamb of God. The idea that Jesus was the Lamb of God was not a theology that any of the synoptic gospels, meaning the gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were aware of. So as far as they were concerned, this was not relevant. So it depends, but it would be 6 hours, it would be 9 hours. People did not die on a cross in 6 or 9 hours. It took them a long time to die. You go ahead and speculate. People were up there for a long time. Josephus describes encountering his buddies, friends of his, up on a cross. He was a very important person, and pleading with Titus to take them down, which they did, and took them down alive. So therefore, all right, so what you could have, this is the only... I am in no way saying this is what occurred. I'm just saying the reason there's a consensus that you had people running around thinking that somebody from the Galilee, which is a very unimportant part of the land of Israel, very uninfluential, very poor, as I mentioned, illiterate. It's not Jerusalem, it's a different neighborhood completely. People would be saying that God's kingdom is coming, the end of the world is coming as we know it. That means the Roman Empire is ending. And then people hoping that this person, in fact, that it would happen as the person said, and then the person is summarily executed by the empire. That's what got you executed. If you robbed a bank, if you raped a woman, raped and killed someone, they did not crucify you. Rome was not as concerned about murder as they were about insurrection, treason against the empire. That was it. Because it was a very expensive, tedious process of putting someone up on the cross and tying the whole thing. That was a huge. It took a lot of time. It would be a lot easier to kill someone just in 2 seconds. They didn't. They wanted the body to be up there, and also for people to think to themselves, if you even think about rebelling against the empire, that's going to be you. You're not going to even get a burial. So bodies were up there, and ultimately the bodies were not allowed to be buried. They were thrown in. Ultimately the skeletal, the remains would fall. Scavengers would eat it, and you wouldn't even have a burial place. I don't want to. I have to resist the temptation of trying to make this work, with the Gospels. But it seems very likely to me, given what are called the doubting passages in the Christian Bible, that there is this idea that we find sprinkled all over the New Testament, that people really weren't sure who Jesus was or who this person was or what his role was. So that has scholars of the New Testament scratching their head going, how did that make it into the text, that people just really were not sure who Jesus was? Why would that have been included? So there are two possibilities. One is that everybody knew who Jesus was, and then somehow someone put in there that people didn't know who Jesus was. Well, why would they do that? What incentive would someone have to do that? As opposed to that people really weren't sure who this individual was. He was just someone who attracted a small group. And people were, in fact, had no clue who he was, had no clue he rose, none of that. Just were clueless about it. And that cluelessness about who he was, the argument of what he was, therefore became a part of the legend about Jesus. And then the Christian text that would later be written would then find a way to insert these doubting passages and then address them. That is a much more likely explanation for this plethora of doubting passages that Jesus even rise from the dead. Well, Mark doesn't have a resurrection account. Mark ends without a resurrection account, although the last 12 verses of your book of Mark, if you're a Christian, if you're a Lubavitcher, you don't have it, but if you're a Christian, or were a Christian or still have a New Testament, those last 12 passages of resurrection accounts were put in later. So what's happening is the writers of the New Testament, again, are highly literate Greek-speaking Christians who are assembling literature and addressing whatever the needs were at that time. And the needs were to understand how did Jesus resurrect? Was he actually physical? Was it just a complete resurrection? Was it some with Jesus raised in some spiritual way, but it was really a spiritual body? Paul is trying to infuse that in 1 Corinthians 15 with there was a different kind of body. It's very clear this is a big problem, and Luke and John in particular with Jesus eating fish and so on, and Luke and Doubting Thomas and John, they're all going to be addressing this. So therefore, scholars generally, when looking at the Gospels, we're looking at things who likely would not be inserted later, but probably are authentic. These are embarrassing texts. So I'm not describing to you what I believe, but I'm describing to you what most scholars, except for the evangelical or devout Christian scholars, would say this would be the simplest way to assemble what might have happened given what we know about that time. Okay, but we don't know why people would. But certainly the incentive to follow anybody would be life is terrible. Could this thing come to an end? No one's thinking human sacrifice of a Messiah. That's what's critical. No one dreamed that the Messiah is supposed to die. There was no literature like that. No one ever. Prior to the advent of Christianity, there wasn't a single piece of literature that suggested the Jewish Messiah was supposed to die. That's what no one was looking for.
אל יתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך. הנה לא ינום ולא ישן שומר ישראל. השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה, בירח בלילה, השם ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך, השם ישמור צאתך ובואך, מעתה ועד עולם. שיר למעלות, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם השם, עושה שמיים וארץ,